Today we will explore one of the most fascinating secrets of medieval metallurgy, the corrosion protection system that blacksmiths created centuries ago, using only materials found in their own villages, which modern science still struggles to surpass. Before we continue with the video, remember to subscribe to the channel for more documentary narratives like this one. There is a word we say without thinking, a word so common that it has lost the weight of its original meaning: blacksmith. In Portuguese, ferreiro, and it is precisely in this word that a clue ignored for centuries resides. The prefix black does not refer to soot, nor to coal, nor to the darkness of the forge. It refers to something that happens to the iron itself when it is subjected to extreme heat, something that modern industry charges dearly to replicate in chemical baths, but which medieval blacksmiths created every time they lit the fire. This black surface, which gave the craft its name, was just the beginning of a process involving 3 layers of protection, built with ingredients that cost absolutely nothing and applied in less than 10 minutes. And we still find tools treated this way in museum collections, with surfaces intact after 600 and 700 years. What did these artisans know that we have forgotten? And why does the modern coatings industry not want this story to be told? Before understanding what the medieval blacksmith did, it is necessary to understand what happens to iron when it is heated. When a blacksmith places a piece of iron in the forge and raises its temperature to the working range, somewhere between 700 and 1100 degrees Celsius, 1292 to 2012 degrees Fahrenheit, the surface of the metal reacts with the oxygen present in the air. This reaction does not produce rust. Rust is iron oxide, that red, porous and brittle corrosion that destroys metal over time, allowing moisture to continue attacking the inner layers. What forms at forge temperature is something fundamentally different. At these extreme temperatures, the surface of the iron converts into a compound called magnetite, whose chemical formula is Fe3O4. Unlike common rust, magnetite is dense and firmly bonded to the surface of the iron. It forms a physical barrier between the metal and the atmosphere, a shield born from the material itself, not applied over it. This is why freshly forged iron comes out of the fire with that characteristic dark blue and black surface. That coloration is not a paint, it is not a varnish. It is the metal itself transformed into a different chemical state. The outermost atoms of the iron have been converted into a protective shell, a stable oxide layer that resists degradation in a way remarkably superior to conventional rust. Magnetite possesses a spinel-type crystal structure, a molecular configuration that confers exceptional stability to the compound. This structure is so resistant that even microbially induced corrosion, known as MIC, has difficulty penetrating it. Materials science researchers have confirmed that magnetite works as a passivation layer on the surface of iron, making it practically inert to further corrosion reactions. In other words, the iron protects itself by being transformed into a more stable oxide. The black coloring that gave the blacksmith's craft its name was, in fact, evidence of a sophisticated chemical process that medieval artisans mastered intuitively, long before science had the vocabulary to describe it. And here is what makes this story truly remarkable. The modern industry has an entire sector dedicated to replicating exactly this process. It is called black oxide finishing. Specialized companies heat iron and steel parts in chemical baths containing sodium hydroxide, nitrates and nitrites at a temperature of approximately 141 degrees Celsius, 285 degrees Fahrenheit. The chemicals force the metal surface to convert into magnetite, the same magnetite a medieval blacksmith created every time he removed a piece from the forge. The modern industrial process was patented in the early 20th century. Companies charge between $2 and $8 per piece for small hardware components and considerably higher amounts for larger parts. What they are selling is a controlled version of what blacksmiths had been doing for free since the Iron Age. The oldest and most widely used military specification for this process is MIL DTL 13924, which covers 4 classes of procedures for different metal substrates. There are also alternative standards, such as AMS 2485 and ASTM D769. All this normative and industrial infrastructure was built around something that a medieval village blacksmith produced as a natural byproduct of his daily work. But there was an important limitation that medieval blacksmiths knew from experience. Magnetite alone is not waterproof. It significantly slows down corrosion, but moisture can still penetrate through micro cracks and pores in the oxide layer. The protection offered by magnetite is real, but it is not absolute. Through centuries of trial and error, blacksmiths understood that this black surface needed something more, and the solution they found was growing in the fields around their workshops. Flax is one of the oldest cultivated plants in human history. Archaeological evidence of its use dates back more than 9,000 years to sites located in Syria and Turkey. The Romans cultivated flax extensively. Pliny the Elder documented that flax seed was part of the rations for Roman soldiers, recognizing both its nutritional value and its versatility. In the 8th century, Emperor Charlemagne issued a decree requiring the people of France to cultivate and consume flaxseed for the benefit of their health. The plant was so fundamental to medieval civilization that its presence in European fields was practically universal. But for blacksmiths, the true value of flax did not lie in the fiber used to weave clothes nor in the seed consumed as food. It lay in the oil extracted from those seeds. Linseed oil. What makes linseed oil different from almost all other vegetable oils is its extraordinary concentration of a fatty acid called alpha-linolenic acid. Linseed oil contains between 57 and 71% polyunsaturated fats. This chemical composition gives the oil a property that medieval blacksmiths exploited masterfully, although they never fully understood the science behind it. When exposed to air, linseed oil does not simply dry like water evaporating from a puddle. It undergoes a chemical transformation called polymerization. Common cooking oils, such as olive oil or sunflower oil, remain liquid or turn rancid when exposed to air for long periods. Linseed oil does something radically different. To understand what happens, one must go down to the molecular level. The polyunsaturated fatty acid chains in linseed oil contain multiple double bonds between carbon atoms. These double bonds are points of chemical vulnerability, places where oxygen from the air can intervene and trigger a cascade reaction. When these bonds are exposed to atmospheric oxygen, they break and form cross-links with neighboring chains. This process is called auto-oxidation. The individual oil molecules cease to be independent and begin to connect, forming a vast three-dimensional network. The liquid oil literally transforms into a solid polymer. This is not a metaphor or a pedagogical simplification. Linseed oil becomes a natural plastic, not the petroleum-derived kind, but a durable, cross-linked polymer that bonds directly to any surface onto which it was applied. And when that surface is hot iron, the resulting bond is permanent. Medieval blacksmiths discovered that applying linseed oil to iron while it was still warm from the forge, not glowing hot, but hot enough for the oil to begin releasing a light smoke, around 200 degrees Celsius, 392 degrees Fahrenheit, produced a dark, resistant finish that prevented moisture and corrosion much more effectively than oil alone applied cold. What they did not know, and what modern chemistry has confirmed, is that heat dramatically accelerates the polymerization process. At room temperature, raw linseed oil can take weeks or even months to complete its cure. At 200 degrees Celsius, cross-linking begins almost immediately. The result is a thin, tough film that fills every microscopic pore and irregularity in the magnetite layer beneath it. The oil penetrates spaces that the oxide cannot seal on its own, and by solidifying into a polymer, it creates a second barrier of protection. In the medieval era, blacksmiths went even further. They boiled linseed oil with lead oxide, a substance called litharge, to create what became known as boiled linseed oil. The lead oxide formed metallic soaps that catalyzed the polymerization reaction, making the oil cure faster and produce a harder film. This technique has been documented since the medieval period in Europe, and its efficacy has been confirmed by contemporary materials science. Researchers studying self-healing coatings have demonstrated that microcapsules of linseed oil embedded in epoxy resin provide superior protection against the corrosion of carbon steel. When the coating is damaged, The linseed oil released from the capsules polymerizes upon contact with air, automatically sealing the breach. The researchers were, in essence, trying to automate with microencapsulation technology what a medieval blacksmith did manually, with a rag and a bottle of oil. The science behind the polymerization of linseed oil is fascinating in its complexity. The process begins when an oxygen molecule inserts itself into carbon-hydrogen bonds adjacent to one of the double bonds in the unsaturated fatty acid. The resulting hydroperoxides are susceptible to cross-linking reactions, forming bonds between neighboring fatty acid chains and creating a polymeric network. Fatty acid derivatives containing dienes, such as those derived from linolenic acid, are especially prone to this reaction because they generate highly reactive pentadienyl radicals. Each step of the reaction produces additional free radicals, which in turn participate in more cross-linking. The process self-propagates until pairs of free radicals combine and terminate the chain. The final result is a film that, while slightly elastic, does not flow or deform easily. It is a truly solid material, born from a vegetable liquid. However, there was a weakness in the oil finish. Although polymerized linseed oil is hard and durable, it is not completely impermeable to moisture over long periods, particularly in outdoor conditions where rain, dew, and temperature variations exert constant pressure on any coating. Medieval blacksmiths had an answer for this as well, and like everything in this system, it was free. Medieval Europe ran on beeswax. Every monastery kept beehives, every church burned beeswax candles. Chandlers, the candle makers, were among the most important artisans in any medieval city. Beeswax was so valuable that in some cases it was accepted as a form of payment for taxes and tithes. It represented an essential commodity in the medieval economy, as ubiquitous as salt or wheat. But for blacksmiths, beeswax was more than a raw material for lighting. It was a finishing material. The method of application was direct and elegant. After the layer of linseed oil had begun to cure over the warm iron, the blacksmith would rub a block of solid beeswax over the still heated surface. The heat of the metal melted the wax on contact, allowing it to flow into every micropore and surface imperfection that the oil had not completely filled. As the metal cooled, the wax solidified into a thin, uniform layer. Beeswax is naturally hydrophobic. Water forms droplets on its surface and runs off without penetrating. It creates a physical barrier against moisture that sits atop the polymerized oil layer, preventing water from reaching the magnetite or the iron underneath. Unlike petroleum-derived waxes, beeswax remains slightly flexible as it ages. It does not crack or separate from the surface the way many modern coatings do, which become brittle over time and eventually peel off. Blacksmiths working today still use this technique. A common traditional recipe calls for a mixture of 2 parts, beeswax to 1 part linseed oil, melted together and applied to iron heated to approximately 215 degrees Celsius, 419 degrees Fahrenheit. The mixture of wax and oil fills the pores and creates a unified protective film. Some blacksmiths add turpentine as a solvent to thin the mixture and facilitate application, although this is not strictly necessary. The result is a finish that deepens the black color of the forge scale, produces a subtle satin sheen, and creates a surface that repels moisture with remarkable effectiveness. There are reports of industrial machinists who applied beeswax dissolved in turpentine to cast iron equipment in their workshops more than 20 years ago. In environments without air conditioning, where condensation regularly formed on metal surfaces, the wax-treated iron showed no rust after 2 decades. If anyone doubts the sophistication of ancient blacksmiths regarding corrosion protection, there is a monument that silences any skepticism. In the heart of Delhi, India, stands a wrought iron pillar approximately 7 meters, 23 feet high, produced around the year 400 AD, during the reign of Emperor Chandragupta II of the Gupta dynasty. This pillar has been exposed to the open air under the elements of the Indian climate for more than 1,600 years, and it has practically not rusted. The pillar weighs more than 6 tons and is composed of wrought iron with 98% purity, an extraordinary metallurgical feat for the time of its manufacture. Researchers from the Indian Institute of Technology, Kanpur, led by Professor R. Balasubramaniam, studied the pillar extensively, and published their findings in the journal Current Science, among other academic publications. They discovered that the pillar's corrosion resistance is due to a thin passive film formed at the interface between the iron and the rust. This film is composed of magnetite, the same Fe3O4 that medieval European blacksmiths created every time they heated iron in the forge. But the Delhi pillar has an additional peculiarity that amplifies its protection: a high phosphorus content in the metal, about 0.25% on average, much higher than that found in iron produced in modern blast furnaces, which typically contains less than 0.05%. This phosphorus was not added intentionally as we know it today, but resulted from the smelting process used by ancient Indian blacksmiths who did not add limestone to their furnaces. In modern blast furnaces, limestone is used to produce pig iron, and in this process, most of the phosphorus is carried away by the slag. The Indian blacksmiths, by omitting the limestone, inadvertently preserved the phosphorus in the metal, and this phosphorus reacts with moisture and air over time to form crystalline iron phosphate, a compound that works as an additional barrier against corrosion. The protective film has grown only 1/20th of a millimeter in 1,600 years. The underlying principle is the same: a stable oxide layer bonded to the metal, sealed by a secondary compound that blocks moisture. Ancient blacksmiths on 2 continents, separated by centuries and entire oceans, arrived at the same fundamental solution. Let us return now to medieval Europe, to examine an application that goes far beyond the forge. Hollywood has taught us that medieval armor was steel polished like a mirror, shining knights mounted on equally resplendent steeds, advancing under banners in the sun. The reality was almost the opposite. The vast majority of medieval plate armor was painted, and the paint used was linseed oil mixed with pigment, most commonly iron oxide, the same hematite that forms naturally in the earth. Viewed under a microscope, hematite particles arrange themselves in overlapping layers like fish scales, creating a physical barrier that makes it extremely difficult for moisture to reach the metal underneath. Iron oxide in linseed oil is not simply paint. It is a corrosion-resistant composite, built on the same principle as the blacksmith's 3-layer system. Only the highest nobility invested in polishing their plate armor until it achieved a mirror finish. Chroniclers of the time recorded that well-polished armor represented the virtue and courage of a knight. Squires were specifically trained to clean, polish, and oil their lord's armor after each use. But this type of maintenance was a luxury. For common soldiers and mercenaries, paint was cheaper and more practical. The English White Company of the 14th century, one of the most feared mercenary bands in Europe, was considered remarkable precisely because they kept their armor bright and unpainted. This was so unusual that it became their defining characteristic and gave them their name. Everyone else painted their armor. This was the standard practice. Even weapons were protected this way. Steel crossbow bows in the Wallace collection in London survive with remains of painted parchment glued over the steel, part decoration, part rust protection. The same linseed oil, the same iron oxide, the same principle. The linseed oil-based system was not an isolated curiosity of the forge. It was the standard corrosion protection technology of an entire civilization. From nails to plows, from the simplest tools to the armor that kept medieval armies on campaign. Linseed oil and iron oxide did the work that today we spend billions trying to replicate with synthetic chemistry. Now let us take a step back and observe the complete system that the medieval blacksmith created. 3 layers, each addressing a specific vulnerability. The first layer is magnetite. The heat of the forge converts the outer surface of the iron into a dense and stable oxide that acts as a chemical barrier between the metal and the environment. This layer is not applied externally. It grows from the iron itself. It is bonded at an atomic level. The second layer is polymerized linseed oil. The oil penetrates the micropores and surface irregularities of the magnetite and then cross-links into a permanent polymeric network. This fills the structural weaknesses of the oxide layer and creates a secondary barrier that is simultaneously hard and chemically resistant. The third layer is beeswax. The wax seals the entire surface, creating an outer hydrophobic layer that prevents moisture from reaching any of the lower layers. It is flexible enough to withstand thermal expansion and minor impacts without cracking. 3 layers in perfect synergy. The magnetite stops the chemical attack. The polymer fills the structural weaknesses. The wax prevents moisture delivery. Together, they form a composite coating system that would be immediately recognizable to any modern corrosion engineer. Compare this ancestral system now with what the modern coatings industry offers. Premium rust-preventive coatings can cost $45 for a single container of approximately half a liter, around 16 ounces. The complete 3-step system, including cleaner, degreaser, and metal prep solution, easily exceeds $80. It requires careful surface preparation, multiple thin coats, proper humidity control below 75%, and a UV-resistant top coat for any outdoor exposure. If the coating chips, the exposed metal rusts. Ceramic coatings, popular for firearms and industrial parts, start at $65 for a single small component. A complete firearm can cost $275 or more. The process requires specialized equipment, a furnace for thermal curing, and professional application. Powder coating a steel bumper costs around $250. And as anyone who has used powder-coated parts in rough terrain knows, the moment the coating chips, corrosion starts underneath and spreads invisibly until the entire coating peels off. The medieval blacksmith system required a forge he already owned, linseed oil extracted from flax growing in the field, and beeswax from the hives that every village maintained. Total cost, nothing. Application time, less than 10 minutes. And when the finish was damaged, he could repair it with a torch and a rag in 60 seconds. The simplicity of the process is almost disconcerting when placed alongside the complexity and cost of contemporary methods. But the story of linseed oil as a metal protector did not end with the Middle Ages. When the Industrial Revolution arrived and factories began to erect colossal steel structures, bridges, ship hulls, railway cars, the structures of the factories themselves, engineers needed a corrosion protection system that worked on an industrial scale. And what did they use? Red lead mixed with linseed oil, the same base system, adapted to the scale of the industrial age. The Forth Bridge in Scotland is one of the most iconic examples. Completed in 1890, this steel cantilever bridge spans the Firth of Forth on the east coast of Scotland and was considered one of the greatest feats of Victorian engineering. When the steel arrived at the construction site, it was prepared at the South Queensferry yard and painted with boiled linseed oil, applied as hot as possible. After assembly into the structure, each piece received a coat of red lead paint, followed by a second coat. Over these 2 layers of red lead, 2 more layers of iron oxide-based paint were applied. The company Craig and Rose won the prestigious contract to supply the red oxide paint for the bridge in 1888 and held that contract for more than a century, until 1999. The bridge became so associated with continuous painting that the expression painting the Forth Bridge entered the English language as a synonym for a task that never ends, as the original painting had to be redone every 3 years, and by the time the painters reached the end of the bridge, it was already time to start again from the beginning. The Eiffel Tower in Paris followed a similar principle. Every major bridge in the world, every warship, every steel building structure from the mid-19th century until the 1960s was primed with linseed oil paint. The hulls of all the Royal Navy battleships were protected by the same drying oil that a medieval blacksmith rubbed onto a warm blade with a rag. The technology changed in scale, but the principle remained unchanged for centuries. And there is an even older and more enduring example of this same tradition. In Sweden, a paint called Falu Rödfärg, or Falu Red, has been protecting wooden and iron structures since at least 1255, when the existence of this earthy red color was first recorded. The paint is manufactured from iron oxide, the byproduct of the Falun copper mine in the Dalarna region. At the height of its production in the 17th century, this mine supplied 2/3 of Europe's copper demand. The residual red sludge from the ore processing was heated and mixed with linseed oil and rye flour to create a waterproofing paint so effective that buildings treated with it centuries ago still stand throughout Scandinavia. The recipe consists of water, rye flour, linseed oil, iron sulfate, and red iron oxide pigment. When applied to wood, the paint is absorbed by the fibers, allows the wood to breathe, and the wood grain remains visible under the matte, powdery finish. The iron oxide pigment is extraordinarily resistant to sunlight, not fading as synthetic pigments do over time. The color can vary depending on the degree to which the oxide is burned, from a bright, luminous red to an almost black tone. And this same paint is the reason why American barns are red. European settlers brought the tradition with them when they settled in North America. Local iron oxide deposits in the states of Georgia, Pennsylvania, Virginia, Alabama, California, Iowa, and Vermont produce similar results. The settlers discovered that a mixture of skim milk, lime, and red iron oxide created an effective sealant against the elements, slowing the decay of the wood. Additionally, the dark red color absorbed more sunlight than the natural color of the wood, keeping the barns warmer during the winter. The material never stopped working. We simply stopped knowing where it came from. Falu Red remains the largest producer of red paint in Sweden today, selling approximately 2 million liters of paint per year. The Falu Rödfärg brand is a protected trademark, which can only be used for products containing red pigment from the Falun mine. And although the original pigment from the mine is a limited resource that will eventually run out, the red color will always be available in some form, as any source of iron oxide can produce a similar result. What makes Falu Red unique is not just the color, but the centuries-old tradition of a recipe that combines the same natural ingredients that medieval blacksmiths used: linseed oil and iron oxide. The irony is sharp. When the factories of the industrial age needed to protect their own steel, they turned to the same system that had existed for centuries. We replaced artisanal knowledge with brands, packaging, and price tags, and we called it progress. But the underlying chemistry remained the same. Linseed oil continues to polymerize in the same way. Magnetite continues to protect iron in the same way. Beeswax continues to repel water with the same effectiveness. The materials have not changed. What changed was who profits from them. For those who wish to replicate the medieval treatment of iron with their own hands, the process is surprisingly accessible. Only 3 materials are needed: boiled linseed oil, available at any hardware store for a modest cost; a block of pure beeswax, obtained from beekeepers or craft suppliers; and a heat source, whether it be a forge, a blowtorch, or even a domestic oven. The first step is to prepare the metal, removing any existing rust, paint, or contamination. A wire brush or sandpaper works well for this purpose. The surface needs to be cleaned down to the bare metal. The second step is to heat the metal to approximately 200 to 215 degrees Celsius, 392 to 419 degrees Fahrenheit. If a temperature gauge is not available, the linseed oil itself serves as an indicator. When the oil begins to release a light smoke upon contact with the metal, the temperature is correct. If the oil burns instantly, the metal is too hot and must cool down a bit. The third step is to apply the linseed oil using a cotton rag. It must be pure cotton, as synthetic fibers melt at these temperatures. Apply a thin layer of boiled linseed oil over the heated surface. The oil will darken and begin to polymerize almost immediately. Any excess should be removed. Thin layers are essential, as thick applications form bubbles and produce an uneven finish. The fourth step is to apply the beeswax. While the metal is still warm but no longer smoking, rub a block of beeswax directly over the surface. The wax melts on contact and spreads into a thin, uniform film. You can buff it lightly with a clean cotton rag. Alternatively, you can pre-mix the wax and oil, melting 2 parts beeswax into 1 part linseed oil, stirring until smooth, and applying the warm mixture with a rag. The fifth and final step is to let it cure. The finish will continue to harden over the next 24 to 48 hours as the linseed oil completes its polymerization. There is, however, a safety warning that cannot be ignored. Rags soaked in linseed oil can spontaneously combust. This is not an exaggeration or a theoretical precaution. In 1991, a fire at the One Meridian Plaza building in Philadelphia killed 3 firefighters. The cause was traced to rags soaked in linseed oil. When polyunsaturated fats oxidize, they generate heat as part of the exothermic polymerization reaction. A crumpled or bunched-up rag provides thermal insulation that traps this heat, and the temperature can rise progressively until the rag ignites. After use, rags should be spread out horizontally on a non-combustible surface to dry, or submerged in water inside a closed metal container. They should never be crumpled up and thrown in a trash can. For ongoing maintenance, it is recommended to reapply a thin layer of the wax and oil mixture once a year for items exposed to the outdoors. For tools and indoor pieces, the treatment can last for years without renewal. The simplicity and effectiveness of this ancestral system are a testament to human ingenuity in its purest form. Close observation, patient experimentation, and the careful transmission of knowledge from master to apprentice over generations. What the medieval blacksmiths created, without ever having access to a microscope or a periodic table, was a materials engineering system that anticipated principles that modern science would only fully understand centuries later. The magnetite layer they produced is the same compound that the industry charges to apply in chemical baths. The polymerized linseed oil is the same cross-linked polymeric network that modern self-healing coatings attempt to replicate with microencapsulation technology. The beeswax seal operates on the same hydrophobic barrier principle used in premium protective waxes. 3 layers, 3 principles, 3 solutions that emerged not from laboratories with sophisticated equipment, but from workshops lit by the glow of the forge, where knowledge was tested by daily use and refined by necessity. The process was not patented. It was not sold in stores. It was simply something every blacksmith knew, passed from master to apprentice over the centuries like a silent inheritance. And then the factories came, and the chemical companies came, and the knowledge was replaced by products with 3-step application guides and price tags. But iron remains iron. Oxygen remains oxygen. And the laws of chemistry did not change because someone decided to charge for them. Perhaps the most profound lesson of this story is not about metallurgy or corrosion protection. Perhaps it is about how we treat the knowledge we inherit. Medieval blacksmiths had no academic training. They had no laboratories. They had no precision measuring instruments. But they had something we often underestimate: centuries of accumulated observation, patiently transmitted from one generation to the next. They knew what worked because their masters knew, and their masters' masters before them. This empirical knowledge, built layer by layer like the very coating they produced, was as sophisticated as anything that comes out of a modern laboratory. The difference is that it did not come with a trademark. The next time you see a red barn in the countryside, or a scarlet wooden house in Scandinavia, or a piece of old iron with that black satiny sheen that defies time, remember that you are looking at the legacy of people who solved fundamental engineering problems with what they had at hand. Oil from a seed, wax from a hive, heat from a forge, and the kind of wisdom that only comes from paying attention to what nature offers. If this narrative changed the way you view the artisans of the past and the materials around you, consider sharing this video with someone who appreciates the kind of knowledge that isn't found on store shelves. If you want to continue discovering forgotten wisdom like this, techniques, materials, and processes that entire civilizations developed and that time almost erased, subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any new episodes. Leave a comment telling us if you have ever tried to protect iron with traditional methods and how the result was. And if there is any ancient technique, any lost material, or any forgotten process you would like to see investigated in depth, tell us in the comments. Every suggestion is a door we can open together. Because the past still has much to teach us if we have the humility to listen.